Did you know a major American city was built entirely on the strength of a financial scam that never delivered a single one of its promises? Did you know Louisiana's coastline is redrawn on official maps every few years because the actual land keeps disappearing into the Gulf of Mexico? Did you know one of the most celebrated military victories in American history was fought over a war that had technically already ended 2 weeks earlier? Did you know the president who bought this entire state for the United States privately believed the purchase might be illegal the whole time he was signing it? Did you know the largest prison in the country sits on a former slave plantation, where the promise of freedom after the Civil War never actually reached the people working that land? And did you know an 85-mile stretch of the same river was promised to bring prosperity to the communities along it, and instead turned into one of the most polluted corridors in the country? Every one of those things is true, and every one of them is written directly into the map of Louisiana. Pull up that map and follow it region by region, and you'll find a place where the land, the water, the war, and the purchase that made it American all turned out to be built on something that wasn't quite what it seemed. Here's the proof, traced exactly where it happened. Pull up a map of France in the year 1719, because this is where the biggest lie actually originates. Decades before Louisiana was even American. And it's the reason the whole territory carries the name it does. In 1717, a Scottish financier and convicted killer named John Law, who'd fled a murder charge in London after a duel and rebuilt himself as a celebrity gambler on the European continent, convinced the French government to hand him control of trade with its North American colonies. Law folded that trading monopoly into something he called the Mississippi Company, and he had one problem to solve. France was drowning in war debt left behind by decades of conflict under Louis XIV, and he needed investors to believe this stretch of the map was worth far more than it actually was, so he told them exactly that. Company promotional material described a land overflowing with gold and silver deposits, fertile soil ready to farm, and friendly native populations eager to trade, almost none of which bore any real relationship to the actual territory. Louisiana at the time held fewer than 700 European settlers. No significant mineral wealth had ever been found there, and much of the land being sold on paper was mosquito-infested river marsh nobody had ever surveyed. Investors bought in anyway. Law issued 50,000 new shares at 500 livres each in 1719, requiring just 75 livres down, and the rest paid off over 19 monthly installments. And by that December, the price had rocketed to 10,000 livres, an increase of nearly 2,000% in under a year, minting so many overnight millionaires that the French language invented a new word, millionaire, specifically to describe them. Law absorbed the East India Company, the China Company, the Senegal Company, and the African Company into a single entity, then secured the tobacco monopoly, and eventually the rights to collect nearly all of France's direct taxes, making his private company and the French state's finances functionally the same thing. By January of 1720, Law had been appointed Controller General of France, running the country's economy on the strength of a colony most of his investors would never see and couldn't have found on a map. Then, in early 1720, a handful of nervous investors tried converting their Mississippi Company shares back into gold coin. Law panicked and passed edicts restricting the use of coin entirely, which only accelerated the run. Share prices collapsed. The paper currency backing the whole scheme became worthless almost overnight. Newly minted millionaires were wiped out in weeks. France's financial system was set back for a generation, and Law fled the country in disguise, dying in poverty in Venice 9 years later. The colony that survived all of this, the actual patch of land at the mouth of the Mississippi that the entire scheme was built to sell, kept the name people had been trained to associate with instant riches, and it's still studied today as one of history's first true speculative bubbles. Follow the map south now, out of the history books and down to the mouth of the Mississippi itself, because the land underneath modern Louisiana turns out to be telling almost the exact same kind of lie, just slower, and it's still happening right now. For thousands of years, the Mississippi River built this coastline the natural way, flooding its banks each spring and depositing fresh layers of sediment across the surrounding wetlands, land quite literally growing itself outward into the Gulf one flood at a time. Natural flooding stopped for a specific traceable reason. In the spring of 1927, record rainfall across 7 states pushed the Mississippi over its banks in more than 100 places, submerging over 16 million acres and displacing close to 1 million people, the most destructive river flood in American history to that point. As the crest moved toward New Orleans that April, a group of the city's bankers made a decision that still shows up on the map today. Rather than risk the levees protecting downtown New Orleans failing on their own, they arranged for the army to dynamite the levee 13 miles downriver at Carnarvon, deliberately flooding St. Bernard Parish and the east bank of Plaquemines Parish to relieve pressure on the city. It turned out to be unnecessary, since major levee breaks upstream released the flood before the dynamited section ever needed to. But the 2 rural parishes flooded anyway, and the businessmen who'd ordered the blast never paid the compensation they'd promised residents there. Congress responded the following year with the Flood Control Act of 1928, putting the Army Corps of Engineers in permanent charge of the entire river and authorizing the modern levee system that now lines hundreds of miles of the Mississippi's banks. That system did exactly what it was built to do, keeping towns and farmland dry. It also did something nobody fully accounted for. Walling the river into a fixed channel severed it completely from the marshland on either side, and without fresh sediment arriving every year, those wetlands stopped rebuilding and started sinking, a process geologists call subsidence, compounded by thousands of miles of additional canals dredged straight through the marsh for oil and gas access, each one letting salt water intrude further inland and killing off the vegetation holding the soil together. Louisiana produces more oil and natural gas than almost any other state in the country, and the industry's own infrastructure, pipelines, and access canals cut directly through wetland is now formally recognized by federal researchers as one of the leading direct causes of the land loss itself. Since the 1930s, Louisiana has lost more than 2,000 square miles of land, an area roughly equal to the entire state of Delaware. At its most severe, during the 1970s, the coast was disappearing at a rate of 1 football field every 34 minutes. Even today, after decades of slower loss, the state is still losing a football field of land roughly every hour and a half, and researchers project that without major intervention, Louisiana could lose more than 4,000 additional square miles over the next 50 years. Zoom into one specific stretch of that vanishing coastline, about 90 miles southwest of New Orleans, in Terrebonne Parish, and you'll find Isle de Jean Charles, home to the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe since the 1830s. In 1955, that island covered more than 22,000 acres, an area roughly the size of Manhattan. Today, it's down to roughly 320 acres, a loss of 98% of its landmass in under 70 years. In 2016, the federal government awarded the tribe $48 million to relocate to higher ground, making Isle de Jean Charles the first community in the continental United States to receive federal money specifically because of land loss tied to climate change. The outline of Louisiana on any map printed today is already out of date, describing a coastline that's still actively dissolving. Push the camera back up toward New Orleans now, because the map holds one more kind of lie. And this one is really the lie of a legend, rather than the lie of a promise. On December 24, 1814, American and British diplomats meeting in the Belgian city of Ghent signed a treaty formally ending the War of 1812. In the age of sail, news of that signature took weeks to physically cross the Atlantic Ocean by ship, and there was no faster way to send it. Nobody in Louisiana had any idea it had happened. A British invasion fleet of more than 50 ships, unaware the war was already over on paper, sailed into the Gulf of Mexico that same winter, aiming to seize New Orleans and control the mouth of the Mississippi River. On January 8, 1815, more than 2 weeks after the treaty had already been signed an ocean away, General Andrew Jackson's mixed force of American regulars, militia, free men of color, and pirates recruited from Jean Lafitte's smuggling operation dug in behind an old canal just outside the city and defeated the attacking British army in a battle that lasted less than half an hour, inflicting more than 2,000 British casualties, including the death of the British commanding general, against fewer than 100 American losses. The battle is remembered as the moment Louisiana and the young country's control of the Mississippi was saved. That's the legend, and on the map it doesn't hold up, because the treaty explicitly stated that fighting would only officially stop once both governments formally ratified it, and the United States Senate didn't ratify until February 16th, more than a month after the battle. The outcome on the ground at Chalmette changed nothing about the territory Louisiana would have kept regardless. The war and the borders it settled had already been decided on paper in Belgium. What actually happened here launched Andrew Jackson's political career all the way to the presidency, on the strength of a fight that, however lopsided, didn't change a single line on the map it's remembered for saving. Trace the border of the whole territory back to how it became American in the first place. And this next lie sits at the very foundation of the purchase itself. In 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte controlled Louisiana, having quietly reacquired it from Spain in a secret 1800 treaty, and President Thomas Jefferson sent envoys to Paris, hoping to buy just the port city of New Orleans and a strip of Florida, authorized to spend up to $10 million. Napoleon, facing renewed war with Britain and deciding the entire Louisiana territory was militarily indefensible and financially useless to hold on to, stunned the American diplomats by offering the whole thing instead, more than 800,000 square miles stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border, for $15 million, a figure that still exceeded what the envoys had been authorized to spend. They signed anyway, gambling that Washington would approve it after the fact. Here's the part almost nobody remembers about the deal that doubled the size of the country. Jefferson himself didn't believe the purchase was constitutional. Nowhere in the Constitution did it explicitly grant the federal government the power to acquire foreign territory and absorb it directly into the Union. And Jefferson, a lifelong strict constructionist who'd spent his career arguing the federal government could only exercise powers specifically written into that document, spent weeks that summer privately drafting a constitutional amendment to formally authorize the purchase after the fact. He wrote to a colleague that what is practicable must often control what is pure theory, essentially admitting he was choosing what was useful over what he believed was technically legal. Word arrived from Paris that Napoleon might be having second thoughts and could still back out of the deal entirely if the Americans hesitated. Jefferson abandoned the amendment, quietly telling his attorney general that the less said publicly about the constitutional problem, the better, and pushed the treaty through the Senate on a vote of 24-7 in October of 1803, choosing to simply not test whether the country's founding document actually permitted the deal in the first place. It would take another 2 decades until an unrelated 1823 Supreme Court case for Chief Justice John Marshall to formally establish that the federal government did in fact possess the constitutional power to acquire new territory. More than 800,000 square miles of the current map, all or part of 15 states between the Gulf of Mexico and the Canadian border, rests on a purchase its own architect wasn't sure the country was legally allowed to make. Slide the frame back down to New Orleans one final time, because the same low, sinking ground responsible for swallowing the coastline nearly swallowed the whole city in the 21st century. And this failure was entirely human-made. Most of New Orleans sits below sea level, a bowl of reclaimed swamp and river silt, held dry only by a surrounding system of levees, floodwalls, and pumps built and maintained by the Army Corps of Engineers. On August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall near Buras, Louisiana, and the storm surge it pushed into Lake Pontchartrain and the surrounding canals overwhelmed that protective system at more than 50 separate points around the city, including catastrophic breaches at the 17th Street, London Avenue, and industrial canals that flooded entire neighborhoods within hours. Roughly 80% of New Orleans flooded, and in neighboring St. Bernard Parish, the number reached 95%. Nearly 1,300 people died, and total economic damage eventually topped $150 billion, making it the costliest storm in American history. In the months that followed, 7 separate engineering investigations reached the same conclusion. This wasn't simply a storm too powerful for the defenses to handle, since Katrina itself, by the time it actually made landfall, wasn't even close to the strongest hurricane on record. The system itself had been badly designed, built in disconnected pieces over decades using outdated soil data that never accounted for how much the ground beneath New Orleans was already sinking. In June of 2006, the Army Corps of Engineers took the unprecedented step of formally admitting fault, releasing a report more than 6,000 pages long that described its own hurricane protection system as, in the agency's own words, a system in name only. Undermined by incomplete construction, inconsistent protection levels, and a total lack of redundancy anywhere along its length. The report also found that engineers had failed to account for the poor soil quality beneath parts of the system and the ongoing sinking of the land itself, which had left some sections of levee as much as 2 feet lower than originally designed even before the storm arrived. The American Society of Civil Engineers went further, calling it the worst engineering catastrophe in United States history. In the 2 decades since, federal, state, and local governments have poured more than $20 billion into rebuilding the system, adding roughly 350 miles of new levees, flood walls, and pump stations, including the largest surge barrier of its kind anywhere on Earth. But trace that same protective ring on a current map and the underlying problem hasn't actually gone away. The ground beneath it is still subsiding, in some places by as much as 2 feet relative to other sections, meaning the very foundation the new $20 billion system was built on is quietly sinking out from underneath it, year after year. The exact same failure mode that doomed the original levees, just moving more slowly this time. Move the camera north now, up the river to a sharp bend in West Feliciana Parish, where the Mississippi wraps around 3 sides of a single 18,000-acre tract of land, larger than the island of Manhattan, because this stretch of the map carries one of the state's oldest broken promises. In the 1830s and 40s, slave trader Isaac Franklin consolidated several plantations here into one operation, naming part of it Angola, after the African nation many of the enslaved people forced to work it had been trafficked from. After the Civil War and emancipation, Louisiana turned its state prisoners over to a former Confederate officer named Samuel L. James under a system called convict leasing, and James subleased most of his black prisoners, many convicted under the black codes that Southern states passed specifically to recriminalize black life after slavery ended, back onto plantations as replacement labor for the enslaved workers who had just been freed. Conditions under convict leasing became brutal enough that Louisiana banned the practice in its 1898 Constitution. And in 1901, the state purchased the Angola plantation outright, roughly 8,000 acres at the time, later expanded to its current 18,000, and turned it into the Louisiana State Penitentiary. Bordered on 3 sides by the river and reachable by only one road, the facility is often called the Alcatraz of the South, for the isolation that same bend in the map provides. The prison that resulted is, today, the largest maximum security facility in the United States, holding roughly 5,000 people, the large majority black, many of whom still work the same agricultural fields their predecessors worked as enslaved laborers a century and a half earlier, cultivating crops including corn, cotton, and soybeans across the property. The promise attached to the end of the Civil War on paper was freedom. Trace this exact bend in the river and you're looking at the specific patch of ground where that promise was rerouted rather than delivered. The same soil, the same crops, and for many of the men working it, the same forced labor under a different legal name. Follow the river south from Angola past Baton Rouge and you'll find a second broken promise stretched across roughly 85 miles of riverbank running toward New Orleans, through parishes named St. James, St. John the Baptist, Ascension, and St. Charles. Before the Civil War, this exact stretch of the Mississippi was lined on both banks with sugar and cotton plantations. After emancipation, many formerly enslaved families stayed on this land and built independent communities here, centered on churches, schools, and multi-generational farms. Starting in 1909, when Standard Oil built what was then the state's largest refinery in Baton Rouge on the site of a former plantation, the same stretch of riverbank was marketed as the next chapter of Louisiana's prosperity, an industrial corridor promising jobs and economic growth to the same communities already living there. Refineries and chemical plants multiplied through the 20th century, especially after World War II, until this 85-mile run of the map held somewhere between 150 and 200 separate petrochemical facilities, producing roughly a quarter of all petrochemical output in the United States. The promised prosperity arrived unevenly. By the 1980s, residents in towns like St. Gabriel, Geismar, and Chalmette were reporting cancer clusters severe enough that the region earned a new name on the map, Cancer Alley. Zoom into one specific point on that corridor, the town of Reserve in St. John the Baptist Parish, a majority black community sitting beside a synthetic rubber plant built by DuPont in 1968 and sold to the Japanese company Denka in 2015. The plant releases chloroprene, a chemical the EPA classifies as a likely human carcinogen, and in 2018, the agency's own air toxics assessment found the census tract closest to the plant carried the highest cancer risk from air pollution of anywhere in the country, at one point measured at roughly 800 times the national average. An elementary school sits less than 500 feet from the plant's property line. In 2023, the EPA and the Justice Department sued Denka and DuPont directly, alleging the plant posed an imminent and substantial danger to public health. Louisiana now carries one of the highest cancer rates of any state in the country, and researchers at Tulane have found strong evidence linking it directly to the corridor's toxic air pollution, concentrated most heavily in the same historically black communities that trace their roots to the plantations that occupied this ground before the refineries did. 2 different centuries, 2 different industries, the same 85 miles of riverbank, and the same pattern. A promise of prosperity made to the people already living there, delivered instead to everyone except them. Pull the camera all the way back out now, past the levees, past the battlefield, past the prison sitting inside its bend in the river until the entire outline of the state fills the frame again. Because every one of these threads traces back to the same underlying pattern, visible on the map if you know where to look for it. Start at the top of that pattern. An entire colony sold into existence on fabricated promises of gold and silver that never existed. A fraud so total it briefly wrecked the French economy and gave the world the word millionaire in the process of losing millions. Follow it down to the coastline today. The same land that fraud was built on top of is still disappearing at a football field an hour and a half. An entire tribe already forced to abandon 98% of their island home to water that keeps climbing. Slide into New Orleans and you'll find a battle fought and celebrated as a defining American military triumph over a war that had, on paper at least, already ended 2 weeks earlier. Trace the purchase that made the whole territory American in the first place, and you'll find a president who signed the deal while privately convinced his own signature might not hold up under the Constitution he'd sworn to defend. Move north to a bend in the river in West Feliciana Parish, and you'll find the largest prison in the country sitting on the same ground where the promise of freedom was quietly replaced with forced labor under a new name. Follow the river south from there, and you'll find 85 miles of promised prosperity that instead delivered some of the highest cancer rates in the nation to the same communities the promise was made to. And underneath the modern city itself sits a flood protection system that failed catastrophically once already, rebuilt at a cost of $20 billion, sitting on ground that is, right now, sinking beneath it exactly the way it did before. Louisiana's official state motto is Union, Justice, Confidence. Trace the actual lines on this map: the bubble, the coastline, the battle, the purchase, the prison, the corridor, and the levees. And what you're really looking at is a place built, quite literally, from the ground up, on promises that turned out not to be entirely true. If you want to see what other states have this same kind of hidden fault line running underneath their history, the border drawn over a lie, the promise made to people who never actually received it, let us know in the comments which state you want us to trace next, and subscribe so you don't miss it.